Great. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this webinar where Belinda Gannaway of Fathom and myself, Hedda of 3C, we're going to be talking about, is culture helping or hindering performance management? But before we get going, we thought we would introduce ourselves. Belinda.
It's great to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation. I know that we could go on all day discussing this, Hedda, but my name is Belinda. I'm a director of experience design agency Fathom XP. I'm also a team and leadership coach and facilitator, and I really focus in on helping organizational leaders understand and step into their role of leading culture.
That's great. And I'm Hedda Bird, and I lead on 3C Performance Management Specialist. We do what it says on the tin. We help people really think through and organise how they want to manage performance to deliver the results they want, which is everything from redesigning entire processes, performance, reward, pay, competencies and structures, right through to delivering frontline development and training to managers and staff who might be looking for help in managing performance or making the most of their performance conversations. So that's us. Let's just have a very brief look at our agenda today. So I've got the slide up here.
We're going to tackle 3 questions, well, actually 4 almost, because we're going to do a little sort of refresh right at the beginning about what do we mean by culture, what do we mean by performance, what do we mean by performance management. Then we're going to dig into the meat of the webinar. So we're going to talk about why does performance management have such a narrow focus on frameworks and toolkits, and what's the consequences of that narrow focus. We'll talk about why focusing on upskilling managers is absolutely the right thing to do, but don't forget the leaders. And then we'll be digging into some of the cultural factors that either enable or stand in the way of an effective approach to performance management.
Brilliant. But we thought we'd start just by clarifying what we mean by different terms. So what, first of all, was performance management. And I know I can see now that I've got some of my existing and previous clients having rocked up. So you know what this is all about. We said it's very simple. It's about ensuring that the people in your organization are doing what you need them to do and working in the way that you need them to work. It's as huge and as simple and as difficult as that. Belinda, quick statement on organizational culture.
Yeah, there are so many different definitions of culture. I really like this one because I think it captures everything. So it's a social order of an organization, like a tacit, sort of often unwritten social order of an organization that really shapes attitudes and behaviors in wide-ranging and durable ways. Those 2 things are really important. To put it another way, cultural norms in an organization will define what is encouraged, what is discouraged, what is accepted or rejected. So with that definition, it's so clear to see how culture impacts both the outcome of performance in the organization, but also how performance is managed. So it's sort of got a double-edged prong, if you like.
Brilliant. And I think then what we see is that those 2 things add together to give us organizational performance, which is essentially, is the organization delivering on its goals? Short term, is it delivering on its strategy, on its vision, and on its mission? So those are the big things that this is why the organization exists. Are we actually delivering on that? So here we've got our first question. Belinda.
So take a breather just to let us digest. The question we're going to be exploring first, why performance management has such a narrow focus on frameworks and toolkits. What is the consequence of that? And what do we do about it? Hedda.
So we don't need to totally look at the question all the time. So I think that what we see is that, and especially I'm often asked to go in and help organizations, and my team are to write a competency framework or to redesign the performance and reward system or help them develop a new form, even something as simple as that. And we see many frameworks and structures being designed and carefully thought about. And OD teams spend a year researching what's the right framework for them to have in the organization, thinking about how they can make it most useful to their existing, to all the people in their organization, and then they throw it over the wall at the organization, provide the training initially, but then they start working on the next framework because they've done all the work, they've established it really strongly, and suddenly other people and the managers are meant to take it on. And what happens is the managers get their one-off training and then nothing further happens. And so they often struggle to use that framework to get the result they want. Belinda, I'm sure you see some of that. What's your perspective on some of these frameworks that are always coming out?
So we do a lot of work around organizational values, which are very often now translated into behaviors and competencies and various other things. They show up in different ways and they're sometimes called different things. But what we know is the vast majority of organizations have something like this, some sort of system of values. And these will either be designed to reflect the culture or sometimes to set an aspirational culture to create a movement towards something new. What happens is these are then reduced, if you like, down to an assessment, and that's where the action stops. So you find out how well you aren't delivering or living these values, delivering these behaviors, whatever it may be. But there's nothing happens to bridge the gap between, oh, now we found something out, to this is how we're going to go on that journey. This is how we're going to shift the dial. So that's the first problem. I think that there's too much overemphasis put on the assessment itself, with not enough put around looking at all the levers that you need to actually make the change that you're seeking. And the consequence of that is not just wasted time and effort. And sometimes this happens in multiple cycles. We keep creating the same things over and over again and hoping we get a different outcome. But so you waste time and effort, but also you create a lot of disengagement and cynicism, which is never going to help in anything that you're trying to achieve in terms of some sort of cultural shift.
I think that's so true. And it's really, really helpful if people in HR and OD can remember that the managers have not been living with this framework for as long as you have, but also to think about what this framework is meant to be for an outcome. So I quite often in an organization will then meet a relatively new manager who say, when I was in this organization, we had a great framework and it worked brilliantly. And when you dig into that a little bit, they often can't remember what the framework actually was. They've got no idea what was in it. They might remember the picture that it looked like. But what was happening was that the leaders in that organization were using that framework to have the conversations that they needed to have, to set the direction that they needed to set, to ensure that people were skilled and focused on the things that really matter. And again, those of you who are my clients who are sitting on this call will know that I am constantly talking about what are the things that really matter and how do we focus on those, and what's the leader's role in doing that. So I think that probably moves us on a little bit.
Beautifully tees up our second question, which is, why focusing on upskilling managers is both the right and the wrong answer, or put it another way, why does leadership matter?
Great. So do you want to kick off with that question, Melinda?
Yes. A lot of the work I do is around trying to tackle this issue that I see in organizations, which I call cultural outsourcing, where the senior leaders of an organization believe that culture is something that somebody else does. And the work I do is trying to bring it back onto the leadership table to help them understand, lean into, make it tangible, not be scared of culture, and really try and pull that lever on organizational success. There was some new research from Gartner that's relatively new, that were kind of like really sort of brought this into sharp relief for me. And the first is they say, so this is looking at this, they were surveying senior HR leaders, and they were asking about their views on culture. Now, more than 50% of these senior HR leaders said that leaders in the organization don't feel accountable for the demonstrated desired culture. I'm like, wow, wow, wow. We know this to be the case. This is my work, right? But that figure is just really, really high. And as Edgar Schein, the granddaddy of organizational culture, says, the most important thing that leaders do is manage culture. And they don't even think they're accountable for it. So of course they're not going to be leaning into the performance management approach and a sort of like bringing culture to life through that mechanism. But the other thing that I think is equally telling, which is about the same number, so slightly more than 50%, so of HR leaders say managers fail to enforce, funny word, but we can explore that another time, fail to enforce the desired vision of culture in their teams. So yes, focusing on managers, giving them the skills to look after performance in line with culture, massively important. But whatever you do, don't leave your leaders out of that equation.
So that's so interesting, isn't it? So when I go and talk to organizations about how they want, what changes they're seeking when they say they want to change how they manage performance, I'll often ask the senior leadership, look, when we've done this new thing, whatever this new thing is, whether it's a new framework or a new performance and reward system or whatever it is, what what do you want to be different? What are you not getting now that you're seeking? And often there's quite a long pause in all of that. And then they go, oh, that's a good question. And it's as if many leaders think that this thing around performance and culture, and we even now have directors of people and culture. So we have organizationally put performance and culture together as if we do understand that those two things are really, really linked. But that's the job of the director of people and culture. And I have to come back and go, no, the job of the director of people and culture is to enable that in the organization totally, to think about how that can work, to think about how that can support and deliver on the organization vision. But it's the job of the organization and the leaders to say, what culture do we want? Where is my responsibility in that? What performance do we want? And I think what we then see is this huge gap between what leaders think they're leading and what they're actually leading. So a classic and very simple example that we have is when we go in and do lots of work with our frontline employees, and I have a whole team of people who go in and run theatre workshops and all sorts of things with frontline employees. And we say to them, what do you most want from whatever this new approach is? What do you really want? And the most common reply is, I really want to know what's expected of me. I don't know what good looks like. I never really get any feedback. Even if I have a performance conversation, I still come out of there going, well, I don't really know where I'm meant to move my performance. And when you then share that with back to the senior leaders, they kind of start rejecting and will be saying things like, of course everybody knows what's going on. Of course they understand. We've been talking about this for ages and ages. But I think we all underestimate, and I'm sure any internal comms professionals on this call will tell us, we all underestimate just how much communication it takes. But also, we don't realize the gap between us saying something and it happening. So when we've had HR people working on a particular topic for a year, they forget that the people that they're then sharing it with, have many other things on their plate and have really only been working on it for a couple of months or so. And so I did have an extraordinary situation with one leadership team I work with in quite a major financial services organization. And the chief exec and one of the senior directors had done a lot of work on the strategy plan for the next 5 years, and they'd really, really worked on the strategy. And they'd done a strategic presentation to the whole organization. And when I talked to the other 6 members of the executive leadership team, they went, yeah, I know he thinks he's done a strategy, but actually, I don't know what the strategy really is. I don't know what it's meant to mean for me. I'm just getting on running my department. And if that's what the executive leadership team is thinking, it's no wonder that it falls down all the way. So, Belinda, thinking about that leadership and culture, what are some of the things that you might want to do there?
So it's about joining the dots, really, not just not allowing HR and other people teams to get into the cycle of keep creating stuff to fill the gap where change hasn't
Totally,
happened.
totally.
And we've worked with an organization, well, we've seen all this happen where multiple iterations of values statements and they were going through another round of this. And the idea was we can't call them values again because people are a bit cynical now, so we'll call them something else. But basically it was the same cycle. So I think for me, it's about stopping, thinking, revisiting the leaders about what this actually means and how you're going to do it, and then having a really good and in-depth look at the culture to see where the fit is. An example where that just didn't happen was I was talking to somebody from shortly after the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, and we were talking about the organizational values and how they were used to support performance or direct performance. And they'd been really strong. When the bank failed, it was about 40 years old. But the values have been really strong in the organization and served the organization really well. But it was going through rapid growth, and they were actually bringing in whole teams from other banks, other financial institutions. And they just assumed that the values were landing and that the way that things were happening in the culture was understood and everybody was on the same page. But they hadn't really done that diagnostic to see if that was really the case. And actually, they had a sort of a faux me, if you like, which is they had the engagement survey was saying that everything was fine. everything's fine. So we don't need to look at, well, values. We don't need to look at performance because everything's fine. Our engagement tells us that everything's fine. Of course, we know that everything isn't fine. But I think for me, the starting point is to have that really meaningful organization conversation at the senior level, but not to ignore culture. Because if you're trying to create change, you need to know the size of the change that you're trying to create. Otherwise, nothing's going to, you're not going to create the performance that you want.
I, you're so right. This whole thing about leading culture and leading performance. One of the things that I really enjoy doing with senior leadership teams is moving them beyond managing performance into leading it. So many of them will have grown up and they'll have had their management training as they've grown up through their development years, and they'll have learned how to have performance conversations. They've learned how to set objectives. They've learned lots of those things. And then they get to the top and they think, well, that's what we need everybody else to do. And because at the executive leadership team, there's less focus on individual targets and goals that haven't been set by the board at a kind of organizational level, quite often the people least likely to have a really good performance conversation are the senior leadership team. And it's a lucky chief exec who gets proper support from their board or their trustees or their organizational kind of governance to really support and help them, which is another reason why bringing in people from outside can really support them. I'm conscious that time is ticking on. For those of you who've joined us since we started, we will be stopping this this kind of conversation just between the two of us at about 10 o'clock, and we will be open to questions from any of you who want to raise questions or share some thoughts. But we're going to just move on and pick up on our third question.
So, question number 3, what are the cultural factors that will enable and stand in the way of an effective approach to performance management? And what do we do about them?
What a huge topic. Shall we?
We've got 10 minutes, we'll be fine.
Shall we just think? I think there's a hidden question in all of that I'm sure that you touch on, and that I certainly do, is it's a real struggle to know what a high-performing organization is. Yes, there are some organizations where high performance is the revenue target, right? And if we make revenue target, we're doing fine, or high performance is the profit target, or sometimes even high performance is the balance sheet target. It's a very simple number. And of course, that completely misunderstands, because those targets are lagging indicators effectively of all the other things that have happened. So in order to hit your revenue target, or in order to hit your profit target, a whole series of other things have happened. So if you're only using that lagging indicator, you're going to be too late to pick up any performance problems. And of course, for other organizations, especially those in the public sector, but not only the public sector, it's much more complicated. I do a lot of work in the higher education sector at the moment, and universities are really struggling with this idea of what is a high-performing university. Now, clearly, financial stability is currently a really, really important part of being a high-performing university, but it's not the only factor that's relevant. So I think understanding what high performance is a really deep and rich kind of place to dig into what are we trying to do here? How are we trying to lead our organization? Belinda, how do you see high performance and an understanding of high performance linking into understanding of cultures? And where do you see kind of some of the kind of crunch where they can miss each other?
Yeah, I think there are multiple ways to cut and slice organizational culture. And you often hear adjectives attached to, we have a high performance culture, we have a high trust culture, we have a high accountability or high blame culture, whatever it may be. You often hear these sort of labels attached to culture. But I think those are often the consequences of some more fundamental dimensions of culture. One of the slices of culture that I like to use is actually on 2 dimensions. So one is about the relationship with flexibility versus stability. And on the other axis, it's looking at how people interact and coordinate. So you've got independent on one side and interdependent on the other side. Now, I like this because it helps us think about how people come together and how that might impact how we go about managing and talking about performance. So if we think that we are very much on the interdependent side, so people are collaborative, collaborative, they work in teams, shared goals, which in brackets we know have a big impact on people's relationship with performance management. We can see that that sort of a culture is much more conducive to ongoing feedback, constructive feedback conversations around performance than perhaps a more independent culture, which is potentially more about autonomy and individual action than potentially even a little bit of competition. Now, I'm not saying that to say that one type of culture is necessarily better than the other. But again, it goes back to the point that I made earlier. Understanding the nature of the culture that you are operating in or the culture that you're trying to move to is absolutely critical to getting your performance management approach correct.
And I think the kind of the conflict that you see there is one that we see a lot. So there are still an astonishing number of organizations who will write the most important things for us are collaboration, teamwork, getting everybody out of their silos, trying to see the big picture. And then their performance management is we rate people on a forced distribution curve. So only a small proportion of people can get the highest rating. We give individual bonuses, not team bonuses. And as soon as you start to do that, your messaging between how you actually are managing performance and the talk that you are giving about how you want people to work kind of come at complete odds. Those of you from the higher education background, it's much better now, but when they first introduced the ratings, the star system for research quality, what happened was people got promoted in the academic structure and valued based on their research quality. And there were a whole series of factors around what constituted, good quality research. And yet the organization, the universities were saying what really matters here is teaching. But people who put a lot of effort into teaching really well were not valued. So it's a very interesting way of us setting up some diametric opposites. We've asked about some success stories. We'll talk a little bit about success stories when we come to what you can do. Thank you very much for that question there. I think what we want to see is people having connection. That's not to say that individual effort doesn't matter, but if your problem in your organization is that people are stuck in silos, there isn't really a sense of team ownership of results, there isn't a strong collaborative culture, and that's what you need, then you have to organize how you manage and lead performance together. So if you as chief exec, I don't think we've got any chief execs on here today, but if your chief exec is managing their 6 or 8 direct reports in this very competitive, individualistic environment, you're not going to get a collaborative culture. But it can be quite hard, can't it, Linda, to get leaders to see that a lot of things that they were brought up learning about performance now aren't really the case.
Absolutely. I mean, culture is embedded over the lifetime of the organization. And if you're a bank that's 300 years old, or that there's a lot to unpick, that sort of below the waterline kind of level of hidden assumptions and beliefs that dictate how people behave. So I think the real key is about real mindfulness, again, just to be really, really clear about what it is you're trying to achieve, how you articulate it, and make sure that your leaders are behaving in a way and performance managing their team and exploring their performance in that same open, collaborative way.
And I think, when we talk about organisational performance, and it's the last point, for those of you who joined late, we're going to talk till about 10 o'clock, maybe 5 past 10, and then we're going to take some questions, and a couple of questions have been coming up in the chat. Do put questions in the chat if you want to ask us things. I was just going to reference a paper that was published by McKinsey earlier on this summer, and it almost was embarrassed. You can feel their embarrassment in this paper going, we're really looking at organisational performance. We're really looking at it. And oh my golly gosh, how we manage performance, our processes, and all the things, and they're bringing culture strongly into that. It isn't anything new. There is no other magic button that you can go and press. It really is about how we do this stuff. So I think, we'd all like to feel there was some other magic button we could press on to get performance, but actually it's about the culture in which we work and the way in which we then bring that culture to life through how we manage it. Shall we move on to our last question?
Yes, I think this is where we're going to talk about takeouts, sort of key takeouts. If you do nothing else, what are some of our points that we'd like to land with you? So again, just sort of a lot of this you will have heard but what are the key things that we recommend? So I'll start, which is to pause, stop creating stuff. It becomes a cyclical thing where people create more and more stuff and add layers upon layers because the thing that they've created in the first place doesn't quite work. So my starting point would be stop creating more stuff. Hedda, what about you?
So I think my starting point would be to really then go into what is it that you want to change. In other words, if what you're saying is nobody's setting goals properly, if it's as simple as that, and that's a very common reason why people initially pick up the phone or send me a WhatsApp or contact us through our website, they're feeling that goals aren't being set properly. And when you go in, you go, well, what? All right, so they're not setting goals properly. So when they are setting goals properly, what is it that you expect will be different? And then you start to unpick actually what the problem is. And the problem may be that we're not delivering results, or it may be that there are a lot of poor performers in the organization who aren't being held to account, or it may be, and classically in some organizations, there's too much of people going off and working on pet projects and not enough focus on core activities. So I think I always begin with, when we've done whatever it is we're going to do, and that's our job as professionals to work out what to do, what is the difference? So then, Belinda, where would you then go?
Well, one of the things I really love about the performance management canvas that you use as sort of fundamental to your work, and it's obviously talked a lot about in the book, it really speaks to me of human-centered design, because what's at the core of the performance management canvas, as I say, is the experience that we're trying to create for our people and for our managers. And actually, if you design around how managers operate and how people come to work and how they show up, then the whole thing that you're creating is going to be much more likely to land. And what I also like about the canvas is it really brings in, and you've already touched on it, this idea of don't just talk to leaders, don't just talk to HR, don't just talk to managers, talk to employees as well, to find out how this is going to work, how this is going to land. I think once you go through that human-centered design approach and take a very agile, iterative approach to continue to go back to test and learn about what does and doesn't work and continue to iterate, you tend to get a performance management system, however light or heavy that might end up being, that really works in the context of that organization. And that's absolute odds to over designing something enormous and then throwing it out there and just praying that it's going to work. It's a completely different approach to what is happening in too many organizations. So human-centered design, working with people to understand what's needed and what's going to work.
I think and you trigger me, and it's not on this slide, but again, it's one of the mantras that we have in 3C, this statement that I own my performance and my manager manages it. And that's not a desired state. That is reality. That's what's going on all day, every day. That in the end, my manager can, put out some carrots and some sticks around what they want me to do. They can be clear as they possibly can, but the only person who can actually alter what I do is me. And therefore, yes, I might need support. Yes, I might need guidance. Hopefully, I'm up for it anyway. But I own my performance and my manager manages it. And that is totally this human-centered design that you talk about, Belinda. I think this is why it's so great when we work together, because though in a sense we've come at these issues from very different starting points, we've ended up absolutely at a complete kind of coherence between getting the culture and the performance to be a coherent tool rather than to be working at odds to each other. I think the next thing that I would say, though, then, that unfortunately, and I'm sure that many of you on this call will know that this is what you have to do, is you have to get a business case in order to take action. And the trouble is, getting a business case from our culture and our performance aren't really working together very well doesn't really cut it with a lot of senior managers, when you might really want to spend some money, and not just money, but you're asking them to invest their time and their precious resources in doing something that, as we've heard, doesn't come naturally to them. So the business case really needs to pick into what came out of that first question from us about what actually needs to change. When we've got that change, what is that change worth to us? And then doing that work, and that change, the worth, if you're in a not-for-profit, might be quite different to the worth if you're in a FTSE 100, but establishing the worth of investing in the change is really, really important. Okay, one more point, Belinda, and then I'll wrap up, and then we can take a chance to have some questions.
I think you've said it all. What would I add to that? What would I add to that? I've got nothing to add to that. I'm looking at the chat and the questions. Actually, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to answer a question in the chat because I think it
Okay, in
was.
that case, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to have a little quick look. Right, okay, pick up a question.
I'm going to pick up Jeanette's question, who asks, is culture more important than strategy? Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to throw out the breakfast quote because
Yeah,
everybody's heard it
yeah.
before. Um, I don't think it's more important than strategy. I think strategy and culture are the two most significant levers that an organization have got to pull to achieve organizational success. But if you don't look after culture, you won't be able to deliver on your strategy. So ignoring one at the expense of another is never going to work. But I think they're equally important.
I think I'm going to resist the breakfast quote, but I think one of my favorite books from, I mean, written many years ago now, and I know a lot of the specifics of it have changed, but if any of you've read Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, it's really interesting in that he talks about getting the right people on the bus before you really worry too much about where the bus is going. Now, I think obviously he's talking about the organization already exists and therefore it's already got something that it needs to do. Clearly, strategy is there to tell you what you are there to do. So you've got a vision, mission, strategy. What are you fundamentally there to do? And your culture surely is that thing around how is this group of people in this set of circumstances going to deliver that result? And I mean, it's really easy. Even if you look at something simple like banking, we may be offering retail banking services, but you go into a member-led organization like Nationwide, or you go into one of the challenger banks, say like Starling, or and by go into, I don't necessarily mean walk into. And those organizations are both providing similar services, but they have very different cultures, which are leading them to very, very different market positions. Yeah, interesting.
Hedda, could
Oh,
I
what else we?
I was
Yeah,
going to throw a
Belinda.
question to you also from Jeanette. Well, actually, it's a comment rather than a question. But successful performance management approach is perhaps about staff awards, individual as well as team recognitions. We've touched on that a little
Yeah,
bit, but love to hear your
yeah,
thoughts on that.
yeah. No, great. And we did an entire white paper, which if anybody wants it, Jeanette, if you haven't got it, just pop a note in there called How to Make Performance Related Pay Work for You. So that's about reward, not just award. We absolutely need to acknowledge individuals. Of course we do. We all want acknowledgement. We all want to be there. Um, Yet it's very, very, very rare in an organization to find people who are truly individual contributors, that most of us are in operating somewhere where things are coming at us from some people and we need to pass on to other people, even if we're working on them on our own at a moment. Um, I'm just thinking back to some work I did in the NHS and some of the stuff that really struck me in the NHS that I think all the leaders in the NHS knows culture is really important, but I was always struck by how in individual wards you could go into one ward and the culture would be very, very different to going into the ward next door. And that came from leaders. But I think, and this is why I'm talking about in answer to this, that in some cultures, people feel valued. People feel really valued. And that is some aspect of recognition. Whether that's actually an award, whether that's employee of the month or a bonus, that might vary. But recognition, I would say, is probably as important as reward, if not. Notwithstanding, there's a cost of living crisis, and there are many people on low wages for whom every penny counts. But Belinda, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, when we're talking about monetary returns for employment, we're sort of in the hygiene level of this. So you need to pay people enough. Of course you do. So it takes it off the table. But actually, by paying people more, you don't necessarily elevate the experience that somebody's having in that organization. Neither
Yeah,
do you necessarily elevate their performance. So I do a lot of
yeah,
work around employee experience. And as you said, feeling valued and appreciated and belonging and recognized for the work that you're doing is much more than a monetary return
yeah,
for it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if you get those, the good news is when you get those things right and you create the experience, so the experience is somebody's individual experience of working in that organization, which is influenced by culture, how they're managed, et cetera, et cetera. when you get that experience right, people are naturally become higher performers. And that's, you can see a great employee experience translating into high performance for organizations across multiple dimensions. So productivity, financial performance, customer satisfaction, etc., etc. So get the experience right for your people, they will perform and the organization will succeed.
So, got a question earlier up. I was looking earlier up the chat, and Meg was asking about successful performance management approaches. So, Meg, one thing I'm not going to do is to say this solution works, because this solution worked for that organization at that time in that place. So the examples that I might give when you're thinking about successful performance management approaches are, where do they connect with the organization's purpose? So one of the examples that I like to give is to think about airlines. Now, I know airlines are, particularly through COVID, obviously they had a very tough time and things go up and down, and they can vary. But if you think about an organization like EasyJet's profitability is based on speed, right? How fast they can turn those planes around, how fast they can get you on board, how fast they can unload, because the more time that those planes are in the air, the more those assets are being sweated, and the more successful the organization will be. Therefore, you need to create a culture where speed of decision making, confidence in working fast, the ability to just think, the ability to move fast is valued, right? And when they got that right, they grew and grew and grew and were very successful. Now we could then compare that. Let us compare that to British Airways. British Airways, as it came out of public sector ownership, decided to invest heavily in a service-led and a quality-led ethos. And for quite a long time, they were never the cheapest, but their service was such that many people were prepared to pay what their premium was, because the service culture supported what they felt they needed from their experience. Now, what happened over time was that the pricing then got out of hand, and then British Airways maybe slightly lost its way and began to struggle with pricing, and then lost their customer service. But the way in which they then managed their performance at the peak of their customer service game was about, have we always put the customer first? Is the first question we ask ourselves, what's going to work best for the customer in this situation? Is the second question we ask ourselves, how can I make this customer have the best possible customer experience? And so on. You can see that managing performance in that context would be very different. And they were very, very successful for a while in managing that. And then things changed and they didn't move on. Belinda, have you got a positive example of where perhaps performance and culture have meshed perfectly?
Yeah, an example that springs to mind is from Experian, and it was when they were redesigning their approach to performance management. And they took this very human-centered design approach to it. So they involved employees, managers, and leaders throughout at every step of the process. And rather than spending a long time building something in isolation and then throwing it over the wall and hope it lands, they built it in small increments. And for me, I've got this lovely visual image of one of the stages of that is that one of the challenges to this sort of incremental design approach can be that it's slow and it can seem to be like taking a lot of time, but it might be slightly slower, but it lands. And this visual image I have of how this worked in practice is when they got to what they thought this whole process was going to look like, they actually took over a room in the office and created a paper interface, like a mock-up interface of each piece of that performance management process. And they got leaders, managers, and employees to walk through, literally walking through the room, thinking about this process and how their experience of it might be, and leave comments along, what works, what doesn't, even better ifs. And I just think that approach to engaging all of your stakeholders along the process and building in small incremental steps, and then you have got something to launch that's going to land well. I think for me, that is bringing their culture of design and employee centricity and their need to improve performance to it brings those two together really neatly. And I love that visual image of them walking the room.
That's a lovely way for us to end, I think.